Not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1334, OneNote Scale Notes Derived by Interval or Modal Distance. List of presentations that we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we spend all of our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we actually build these tables in Excel, practicing Excel music and table visualization skills all at the same time. In prior presentations, we've been mapping out the intervals for all of the different modes, comparing and contrasting them. This time, we're going to use that information to actually map out the notes and visualize them on the fretboard, not only for the collection of notes that we keep on working in, those 7 notes around the key of C, but also for different collections of notes so we can move a little bit more around the fretboard. So what have we done in prior presentations? We've got our list of notes, 12 notes. We have listed them by letter and number. We have typically been working in the key of C, 7 notes around that. How do we derive those? We use our formula from C. We go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That gives us our collection of 7 notes. We then listed out all the intervals, noting that if we're going in the clockwise direction and there are only 12 notes, if I start from a C, I can only go a distance clockwise, or in this way down, in the way it's been set up here, 11 steps, or 12 if you include the one we are on. We have then listed the names for those 7 steps, which basically have 2 units of measurement in them, even though we don't always say one of them, that being the notes. That's the first number that most people just kind of drop off. And then the second number is going to be the scale degree, which is actually off by 1. That's the distance up from the note that we're on. And the third measurement is this M, which is basically comparing that interval to the major scale, but that's kind of, you don't really need that. I would actually recommend that you don't see that as a major information giving thing, because if you add the 4, you don't need the M. Also note, we want to go in the counterclockwise direction. So we listed out all of the names going counterclockwise, which is messy because the scale degrees fall apart counterclockwise, which we discussed in prior presentations. We then listed out all of our modes from the Ionian, Dorian, Lydian, and so on and so forth, because the modes have the same intervals for all 12 collections of 7 notes. So this generically will work for all of our collections of 7 notes through all of the modes in all of those collections of 7 notes. So now we're going to take this information to actually map out the note names so we can see the note names on our fretboard. But how did we do these? We have the scale degrees, we have the Ionian node. What we're going to do, usually we start going forward. So if I'm going to measure or build my notes around an Ionian node, which could be any of the 12 notes, which I'm going to label as an Ionian, scale from it, then I can measure from the Ionian and then everything around it, an II, an ID, an IP modal range, an IY modal range, Ionian to Lydian, an Ionian to mixed Lydian, Ionian to Aeolian, Ionian to Locrian. That's going to be a 1-1 from a numbering standpoint, like a natural number system, a 1-2 modal range, a 1-3 modal range, and so on. So in other words, to go up, for example, 3 note half steps, which would be the 4th scale degree, it's going to take us 5 note half steps to get up there. So we call that then a 5 note away perfect 4th. Most people don't say 5 note away, they just say perfect 4th, but you'd want to know that it's 5 note away, and then you could drop the P because it's not really giving you any more information if you say it's a 5 note away 4th. Or I'd rather call it a 5 note away from the Ionian node 3rd modal half step. Notice that neither of these terms actually tell you the note that you're on. This one tells you the relative position within the scale, which is the Ionian. And then when we go in the counterclockwise direction, which most people don't understand that much because the scale degrees fall apart going counterclockwise, we can go up this way, going -1 modal half step back. That means I'm going to go I back to the Locrian, Ionian to Locrian, or a 1-7 modal range, a 1-6 modal range, a 1-5 modal range, and so on and so forth. Now remember the two ways that we can basically visualize our notes. We can do it this way as kind of like a number line. If I start from this C, for example, I can imagine it going infinitely up. This would be to the right if it was listed out like a note number line, or infinitely down if we're counting down. Or I can see it as a circle, meaning it's going to keep on repeating as we go around in a circle. So, but we also have directionality. So I could, of course, go on a note number line in the opposite direction. So you can kind of visualize it as a piano, but the piano has both directionality to the right, it has directionality to the left. We often forget about directionality to the left. Now, what about when we get to a fretboard? A fretboard seems more complex because now we have a more dimensions. You can go up, down, you can go left, right. So you can not only go left, right, but you can go up, down would be a better way to say it, possibly. So in other words, if I was to say I'm on this C right here, then of course I can go to the right, I can go backwards. So how am I going to apply this directionality concept to a fretboard? Well, it's still basically directional. It's just that we have repeated notes because the strings are basically staggered piano layers on top of each other, right? That's one way that you could kind of think of it. So obviously, in other words, this D right here is the same as this D down below because there's usually a distance of 5 between the strings, although this one has a different distance because this fault line, these two strings, you can imagine, basically got shifted up if you continue our continent and global analogy. But in essence, what would happen then, the notes that are going up, if you look at the guitar, and this is the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, then going to the right is going to be going, this way up to the right from the note we're on, and it's also going to be going down from the note that we're on. So if we're going to use our compass analogy, meaning we're going to put the pointer of the compass on the Ionian, and we're going to build kind of like a circle around it, but it's not exactly a circle. It's going to be the shape that's going to be the collection of notes for the Ionian scale, right, that we're going to make around this pivot point. So then what happens when I go down the string? Well, notice that this note repeats over here. So as long as I'm above that, then this is still basically going up, in pitch, right? So we're going basically up in pitch going this way. And then when I go in the negative direction, what's that doing? From a note standpoint, we'd be going backwards this way, right? So everything back here would be on the negative side of the note number line as I'm measuring in the opposite direction from this note. And then if I go above it, now you can see 5 notes this way, because there's 5 notes between the string, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the same note, right? So everything going on this side is going actually lower in pitch because you're going to the heavier strings as I'm going out this way, right? So that's going to be the general idea. So if you were on a piano, which is like one string, we have directionality going from a note number line perspective to the right and to the left. If you're on a guitar, you could still kind of visualize it like you're going up or down or like a note number line, but because the strings are layered, you got to imagine that when you're going clockwise around the circle or up in pitch, that's going down towards the floor on the guitar. And when you're going counterclockwise, then or lower in pitch, that's going to the left and up towards the heavier strings towards the ceiling. Okay. We're now going to take our fairly generic concept of our modes and the distances around any of the modal points, thinking of them kind of like a cookie cutter that we're going to be putting into the dough of the fretboard. But to do that, I have to know where in the dough of the fretboard we want to be applying the cookie cutter. We can imagine then our analogy of the fretboards being similar to the planet. It's basically rotating around, has 12 degrees of rotation. We have to choose one of those 12 degrees of rotation, in other words, one of the notes to assign as a nodal point as a basis or a point from which we can apply the cookie cutter shape to. We're going to start with the most familiar, that being the collection of 7 notes around the C major. So in other words, I'm going to make the C note the Ionian, and then I'm going to apply the cookie cutter of the shape that we can derive from modal distances or intervals onto that C note. Then we can measure that cookie cutter shape that we put on it by looking at the distances from each of the nodes to each of the other nodes, or also we can now assign that to the note name. So we can measure the distances in notes, we can measure the distances in the modal ranges that we've been working on. So we've been thinking, in other words, in a generic concept of modal ranges, which works for all 12 collections of 7 nodes. But once we put the cookie cutter on the fretboard, then of course we can use these same distances to apply to the notes that are being assigned to the node names. Okay, so let's see if this makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So what we're going to say is let's first build out to the right. So I'm going to go to the right and down, which means we're going to go clockwise from our modal distance concept. So if we have a scale degree, it's going to be the first scale degree. We have a modal distance of 0. Right, so that means we didn't go anywhere. So if we assign the C as the Ionian, then we didn't go anywhere. So that means that up here, we're on the perfect first, and we didn't move anywhere. Okay, nothing happened. Great. So now we're going to say we're going to go the second scale degree. The modal distance is going to be 1, meaning we're going to go 1 continent up for our continent analogy from the C note. That's going to get us to a D. Why? Because we're going to say that we went from... now it's going to be an ID modal range, not a D note, but the D is the Dorian in this case. We went 1 modal half step up, which would be the second scale degree, which is 2 note half steps up. We call that a distance of a 2 note away major second. I'd rather call it a 2 note away from the Ionian node first modal half step. So if I pull up my, let's try to do a different color here. We'll make these maybe yellow. I don't know. Let's go here. So if I go 2 nodes up, we're going to be right here on that one. Now also note, if I go down to draw the circle around this, there's a fault line here. So usually there's 5 notes between the strings, but this fault line moved up. It shifted up. So it's going to be 5 notes to get up here, and then boom, boom, boom. So we get to the same. So this note, in other words, this and this are the same note. So also right here is going to be a distance of a 2 note away Ionian first modal half step or 2 note away major second. So we're measuring around that node. Now you might also say, hey, look, there's a 2 up here, as there's a Dorian up here as well. Why is that? Because that's going to be a different octave. So if I count that out, that would be 5 going this way, 10 going down, 11, 12, 13, 14. So that's a 14 note away, and 14 minus 12 is 2. So it's going to go around the circle in another lap, basically an octave up. But we're measuring going to the right and over. So that's going to give me the notes, but I want to be able to see them both ways, because the better way to see it is really to be able to visualize that it's an ID modal range, because the ID modal range will always have a 2 note away distance. The C to the D will always have a 2 note away distance as well, but the C to the D will not always be in the collection of notes that I'm working on, whereas the I to the D will be on all collection of notes that we work on, because all the collection of notes will have the same parallel cookie cutter shape. Okay, so let's go to the next one, and we're going to say, okay, what if I go down to an IP modal range? That's going to be, the scale degree is 3, modal distance is 2, so that's going to bring me up to an E. Why? Because now we're going from the Ionian to the Phrygian. It's a 1-3 modal range. It's a 2 modal half steps up, which would be the 3rd scale degree. It would be 4 notes up. So we call that a 4 note away. I use a 4 note away major 3rd, or a 4 note away from the Ionian node, 2nd modal half step.